There's a variety of proteins that can be used to defend us non-specifically. The two that we're going to talk about right now are complement and interferon. We already talked about perforins, which were a type of protein released by natural killer cells that can kill self cells. So these are other examples of non-specific proteins that defend. Complement is actually a group of proteins. It's a whole bunch of different proteins that once activated, they assemble into these structures that poke holes in the cell membrane of defensive cells. So in terms of their function, they're a lot like the perforins because what they do is they make the pathogen leaky and basically that kills the pathogen. But complement proteins are much more complex and they're much more potent. So once they're activated, these are proteins that are actually in our blood plasma, these complement proteins. And once they're activated, they self-assemble into these membrane attack complexes, killing the pathogen. So these are actually pretty cool proteins. Interferons are another group of proteins, but these are a little bit different. These don't actually attack cells. Instead, they're a signaling type of chemical. Interferon is a protein that doesn't attack. Instead, it's a signaling molecule. Interferon is released by virally infected cells, and basically it's a shout out to the neighboring cells telling them that there's a virus in the area and that they should get prepared. This is sort of like if a castle is attacked in secret, right? And the enemy takes over the castle. And then some of the people that are inside the castle are able to raise a flag that basically signals to the surrounding area, hey, look, we are under attack and you should probably get ready too. That's kind of what interferon is doing. Interferon isn't going to help the virally infected cell, but it will help the neighboring cells to prevent them from becoming infected by the virus. So that's why I put a picture of smoke signaling on here because it's a signaling molecule more than anything else. Fever is another nonspecific defense. Fever is caused by chemicals called pyrogens. You've probably heard the prefix pyro before, right? Like pyromaniac or pyrotechnics. Pyro means fire, and pyrogens are chemicals that are released by pathogens and by our own cells that cause the temperature in our body to be reset. The temperature regulation area of our body is found in our hypothalamus. So these pyrogens eventually lead to signaling that tells the hypothalamus, let's maintain body temperature at a higher set point. So the next question is, why is that helpful? Why is it beneficial to have a fever? Because fever is beneficial, right? One thing that research has shown is that when we run a fever, our body tends to sequester minerals. To sequester means to kind of put them all together in one spot and hide them away. And this is very common, like for example, with iron in the liver. When we have a fever, iron is sequestered in the liver. You might think, well, what does that have to do with anything? Well, it turns out that a lot of pathogens require iron to grow. And so by taking the iron out of our bloodstream, not out of our red blood cells themselves, but out of the bloodstream, which acts as like a pool of nutrients, and putting that iron and hiding it away in the liver, we're basically taking away a food source, if you will, a nutrient source for the pathogen. Another reason why fever can be beneficial is because as temperature goes up, enzyme activity tends to increase. So we know that enzymes are temperature sensitive. A lot of the enzymes in our body work better, faster at higher temperatures. So this slight increase in temperature is able to boost our metabolism a little bit, especially our metabolism for our defensive cells. So you can see why that would be beneficial. Now, too high of a fever for too long is bad because it causes our proteins in DNA to denature. So we have to be careful with fever and make sure it's properly regulated. Inflammation is another part of our nonspecific defenses. Inflammation is important for helping to defend against pathogens, and it's important for healing too. So inflammation isn't always started by an infection. It can be started from an injury, and some of you are probably pretty well aware of that. Like if you've sprained your ankle before, you know that that's not infectious, but there was still inflammation there. There are cardinal signs to inflammation, and there's 4 to 5 of them, depending upon whether or not you count the last one. So let's take a look at these. The cardinal signs of inflammation include tumor, rubor, dolor, and color. And if that sounded crazy to you, that's okay because that's Latin, right? So let's do this in English now, right? Tumor would be edema or swelling. So swelling is a part of inflammation. Rubor is redness. So redness is also common in inflammation. Dolor means pain in Latin, right? So oftentimes when inflammation occurs, there's pain. Sometimes the pain can be swapped out for itching, especially if we're talking about the skin. Calor is warmth. So inflammation is also associated with warmth. Those are the 4 cardinal signs. Some people throw in a 5th sign, which is limited use, and I don't have a fancy Latin name for that one. So when an area is inflamed, it very much limits our ability to use that, right? And that's so that it can heal properly. There's basically one reason why an inflamed area is swollen, red, and warm. What is the warm red stuff that's coming to that area? And if you said blood, you're right. The swelling is caused by lots of blood coming to the area. The warmth is caused by blood being warmer than our typical body temperature. And of course, the redness is caused by the blood itself, which is red. Functions of inflammation include bringing defensive cells to the area, helping to limit the spread of pathogens if present, initiating injury repair processes, and removing any dead cells and tissues. As I mentioned previously, inflammation doesn't have to be initiated by infection. It can be initiated by injury. But what are the actual signaling things that cause inflammation to occur? Basically, what happens is that when damage occurs, whether that's from infection or injury, the damaged cells release their contents into the bloodstream, basically because they're damaged, they break open and their insides spill into the bloodstream. And that stuff is supposed to be inside of cells, not out. And the presence of these abnormal contents in the bloodstream is going to cause the release of the chemicals that are going to initiate the inflammation process. Cells that can recognize pathogens can also release chemicals that initiate inflammation. I want to talk about a few of the chemicals that are used in the process of inflammation. Cytokines and prostaglandins. We've already talked about cytokines in this class before. Cytokines are chemical signals that are used to activate our nonspecific cells like neutrophils and macrophages. But cytokines are also used in the process of inflammation. But they also have other properties. They are also chemicals that can help us fight cancers, fight tumors. They help to recruit white blood cells to an area for that chemotaxis that we talked about. They are part of the signaling pathway for fever. They have antiviral properties and lots of other functions. Prostaglandins are a different structure than cytokines. So prostaglandins are actually made from a steroid or a fat. And prostaglandins, like cytokines, do promote inflammation, but they have other functions too. Perhaps in your previous biology class, you talked about how prostaglandins cause sensitization of nociceptors. Basically, what that means is it makes pain cells more sensitive. Like cytokines, prostaglandins also recruit white blood cells to an area of injury or infection, so that's chemotaxis again. Prostaglandins also make blood vessels wider and leakier, so like histamine, they cause dilation of our blood vessels. What's kind of interesting about cytokines is that there are different classes of them, and a certain group of cytokines, rather than promote inflammation, they actually stop inflammation from occurring. So this is a pretty complex process. Before we leave the topic of inflammation, I want to talk about something called systemic inflammatory response syndrome, or also known as SIRS. This is an inflammatory state that affects the whole body, and it can be caused by injury or infection. Sometimes this is called systemic inflammation, and if it's caused by an infection, it's sometimes referred to as sepsis. This is a life-threatening condition. Basically, what happens during this systemic inflammatory response is that multiple organs begin to fail due to this excessive inflammation. You might have heard the term cytokine storm before. So, a cytokine storm is a subset of systemic inflammatory response syndrome. A cytokine storm occurs when there's excessive release of cytokines. Typically, our body doesn't do this unless it's like a very last ditch effort to clear out some sort of infection. So we actually see this in cases of Ebola infection, and we are seeing it sometimes with coronavirus infection too. The body gets to the point where it doesn't have any more defenses against the virus, and the last thing it can possibly do is release all of these cytokines and try to clear the infection that way. But typically, the cytokine storm results in more problems than it actually helps. Like I said, it can lead to multiple organ failure and it can often lead to death.